You've entered Void of Rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 3,000 corrupted souls, but the Void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the Void? Now let's jump into today's story. The mountain path to Targlin Vale carved through ancient pines like a wound that refused to heal. Father Matthias Crane's boots crunched through snow that had been falling for 3 days straight, each step taking him deeper into a landscape that seemed to exist outside of time itself. His breath formed clouds in the bitter air, each exhale a prayer he wasn't sure anyone was hearing anymore. The leather satchel bouncing against his hip contained recording equipment and blessed implements, tools of his trade as what the Vatican quietly called a listener priest. But as Crane climbed higher into the Carpathian peaks, he began to notice something strange about his own footprints in the snow behind him. They were filling in too quickly, disappearing within minutes, as if the mountain itself was trying to erase all evidence of his passage. And when he looked closely at the path ahead, he could swear he saw other boot prints, older ones, nearly obscured by time and weather, but following the exact same route he was taking. The Vatican had many secrets, but none darker than the existence of men like Crane. While most exorcists fought to banish demons, listeners were sent to observe, to record, to witness horrors that the church needed documented but never spoken of publicly. In 32 years of service, Crane had seen possessions that defied every ritual in the book, entities that laughed at holy water and twisted Latin prayers into obscene songs. But he had never received a letter quite like the one that brought him here. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. He remembered that detail with unusual clarity, because Tuesday was the day he always visited the archives to file his reports. But when he tried to remember which Tuesday, which month, which year, the memory became slippery, elusive. It could have been last week or last decade. Time seemed negotiable in the business of supernatural documentation. The village of Targlin Vale emerged from the perpetual snowfall like a wound in the mountainside. Stone houses sagged under the weight of accumulated snow, their windows either boarded shut or gaping black like the empty sockets of skulls. Smoke rose from only 3 chimneys, thin grey threads that seemed to dissolve into nothing before reaching the sky. What disturbed Crane most was the complete silence. No voices, no footsteps, no barking dogs or crying children, just the whisper of falling snow and the distant groan of settling wood. But there was something else, something that made his skin crawl without him understanding why. The village looked familiar. Not just familiar in the way all mountain villages shared certain characteristics, but familiar in the way a childhood home feels familiar even after decades away. He could predict which house would have the blue shutters, which stone wall would have the crack shaped like a lightning bolt, which chimney would be leaning at a dangerous angle. 3 weeks earlier, or was it 3 years, a wax-sealed letter had arrived at Vatican archives written in shaking Latin by Father Vasilei. Send only a listener, one who records but does not interfere. The girl in Targlin Vale is not possessed in any way we understand. Do not attempt the rite. It sees through our prayers and turns them against us. Come only to witness. God help whoever must see what I have seen. The letter had been accompanied by photographs, grainy, unfocused images that seemed to shift when Crane wasn't looking directly at them. In one, a young girl sat in what appeared to be a basement, her mouth sewn shut with dark thread. But when he looked again, the thread seemed to spell out words in a language he didn't recognize. In another, the same girl stood in an empty field, but her shadow fell in 12 different directions at once, each shadow pointing towards a different mountain peak. The final photograph showed only an empty room, but Crane could swear he saw movement in the corners when he held it to the light. Movement that looked suspiciously like his own silhouette, even though he had never been in that room before. Had he? As Crane walked through the empty streets of Targlin Vale, he found the locals pretending not to notice him. But their pretense was too perfect, too coordinated. Curtains twitched as he passed, but when he turned to look, the windows were empty, yet he could feel eyes on him, watching from impossible angles. A woman crossing the square saw his collar and crossed herself backwards. Once, twice, 3 times, then hurried away without looking back. But as she disappeared around a corner, Crane heard her whisper his name. His name, not father or priest, but Matthias. She had whispered, "Matthias is back." The few villagers he managed to approach seemed incapable of giving straight answers, but their evasions were too similar, as if they had all rehearsed the same script. When he asked about the Voress family, their eyes would glaze over, and they would mutter about the old ways, about things that should stay buried, about prayers that shouldn't be answered. But underneath their words, he heard something else. Familiarity. They spoke to him like they knew him, like he was a regular visitor who had simply been away for a while. One elderly woman grabbed his arm with surprising strength and whispered, "Father, why did you come back? You said you wouldn't come back. You promised the last time was the last time." When he tried to ask what she meant, she looked confused, as if she had spoken without meaning to, and hurried away muttering prayers in Romanian. At the village's heart stood a stone church that looked older than the surrounding buildings, older than the village itself, older perhaps than the mountains that surrounded it. Its bell tower was crooked, leaning at an angle that should have brought it crashing down decades ago. The tower was topped with iron crosses bent at angles that seemed to follow no earthly geometry, their points twisted into spirals that drew the eye inward and downward, towards something that waited in the depths. The heavy wooden door of the church stood ajar, creaking softly in the wind like a mouth trying to speak. But as Crane approached, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Carved into the doorframe, worn smooth by decades of weather, were initials MC 1987, 1995, 2003, 2011, 2019. His initials, dates spanning 32 years. Dates that corresponded, he realized with growing horror, to gaps in his memory. Times when he thought he had been on sabbatical or recovering from illness, or engaged in classified church business that he was never able to clearly recall. Inside the tower's cramped upper room, Crane found Father Vasilei. The old priest was a scarecrow of a man, his cassock hanging loose on his skeletal frame. He was nearly blind, his eyelids fluttering constantly, as if watching invisible movements in the air around him. His hands shook with palsy as he gripped a small codex bound in cracked leather, with what appeared to be bone fragments pressed into the binding. When Crane entered, Vasilei didn't look up from the book, but he smiled, the expression of such profound sadness that it nearly broke Crane's heart. "Welcome home, Matthias," Vasilei whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. "I was wondering when you'd remember the way back." "I've never been here before," Crane said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they were lies. The room was too familiar, too comfortable. He knew without looking that there would be a loose floorboard by the window, that the third stair creaked when you stepped on it, that the crucifix on the wall was hung upside down, because Vasilei's hands shook too badly to hang it properly. "Haven't you?" Vasilei asked, finally raising his blind eyes to Crane's face. "Then why do you know where I keep the brandy? Why are you reaching for the chair that fits your height perfectly? Why are you avoiding the corner where the shadows fall wrong?" Crane looked down and realized he had indeed moved towards a specific chair, his body acting on instincts he didn't remember forming. His hand had started toward a particular shelf where, he somehow knew, a bottle of Romanian brandy sat hidden behind theological texts, and he had, without conscious thought, positioned himself to avoid a corner of the room that made his eyes water to look at directly. The old priest's room was a chaos of religious artifacts and protective charms, but not random chaos. Organized chaos, the kind that develops over years of careful arrangement and rearrangement. Crucifixes hung from every wall, but they were all inverted, not through sacrilege, but through a kind of desperate logic that Crane understood, without being told. Bottles of holy water sat opened, their contents long since evaporated, leaving behind crystalline residue that formed patterns too complex to be natural. Candles burned in configurations that made no sense to the casual observer, but were perfectly logical to anyone who understood the true geometry of faith and fear. The air smelled of incense and something else, something organic and wrong, like flowers blooming in soil mixed with grave dirt, but underneath those scents was another smell, fainter but more disturbing, the scent of his own cologne, as if he had been in this room recently many times for many years. Vasilei showed Crane the codex with trembling hands. The pages were filled with crude sketches, ritual circles, Latin phrases crossed out and rewritten in different hands, desperate annotations in multiple languages. Some pages were torn, others water-stained or burned around the edges, but what caught Crane's attention were the margins, filled with notes in his own handwriting. Notes he didn't remember making, observations in his own distinctive script, sketches in his own artistic style. On one page, a diagram showed the church's basement with intricate measurements and notations. In the margin, in his own hand, was written, "The girl is not the vessel, the girl is the key. The vessel is the one who returns." On another, a list of names, villagers, he assumed, with dates spanning back 50 years. Most names had been crossed out in red ink, but at the bottom of the list, in fresh black ink, was his own name with today's date. 43 years I've been in this village, Vasilei said, his voice carrying the weight of profound exhaustion. I came here young, full of faith, ready to serve God in this forgotten place. I thought I was the village priest, the protector of these simple mountain people. But I was wrong about my role here. I wasn't sent to protect them. I was sent to record what happens to them, to document the cycle, to wait for you to come back. He turned to a page near the middle of the codex, which bore a drawing labelled simply Zuliel. The image was crude but somehow unsettling, a figure that seemed to change depending on how long you looked at it. Sometimes it appeared humanoid, other times bestial, and occasionally it looked like nothing more than empty space outlined in charcoal. But in the corner of the page, in his own handwriting, Crane saw a note that made his hands shake. Not what it appears to be, not what I thought it was, not what it wants me to think it is. Remember, the demon is not in the girl, the demon is in the priest. The demon is the priest. This one doesn't want to leave, Vasilei continued, his blind eyes somehow finding Crane's face. It doesn't want to be banished or cast out or sent back to whatever hell spawned it. It wants to be seen. It wants to be understood. It wants to be remembered. And once you see it truly, once you really see it, it sees you back. Through time itself. Through every moment you've ever lived, or ever will live. Vasilei's hands trembled as he turned the pages back to show Crane more details. Each page revealed new horrors, new insights into a truth that Crane was beginning to remember, despite his desperate desire to forget. The girl, Alina Voress, 14 years old. She's been in her father's cellar for 6 months now, but that's not the first time she's been there. Look. He pointed to a page filled with dates and names. Alina Voress, 1987. Maria Ionescu, 1995. Elena Popescu, 2003. Sofia Stanescu, 2011. Anka Dumitrescu, 2019. Different girls, different families, but the same age, the same symptoms, the same duration of possession, the same priest coming to witness their suffering. "They're not different girls," Crane whispered, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. "They're the same girl, different names, different families, but the same... what? The same soul, the same vessel." "The same bait," Vasilei corrected sadly. "The same trap, reset every few years when the previous witness forgets what he's learned. When you forget what you've learned. Because you always forget, Matthias. That's part of the gift it gave you. The ability to forget the unbearable truth, so you can discover it again with fresh horror." The old priest reached under his cot and pulled out a wooden box filled with iron chains, wax candles, and coils of twine that reeked of oil and ash. But underneath these obvious tools were others. A tape recorder identical to the one in Crane's satchel, notebooks filled with his own handwriting, photographs showing him in this very room, taken across decades. "Her father chains the cellar door shut every night with these," Vasilei said, holding up the protective implements. "Old protections passed down through generations. They don't work anymore. They never worked. But they make him feel like he's doing something, like he has some control over what happens in his house. The truth is, the chains aren't there to keep something in. They're there to make sure the right person comes to investigate, to make sure you come back." Vasilei leaned closer, his blind eyes somehow boring into Crane's soul. "I've watched you try to help her, Matthias. 5 times now I've watched you descend into that basement, convinced that this time will be different. This time you'll understand what you're dealing with. This time you'll find a way to save the girl and cast out the demon. But you never do, because you are the demon. You've always been the demon." That night, Crane lay in the small room Vasilei had prepared for him in the church's attic. The same room he had slept in before, many times before, though he was only now beginning to remember. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that felt more like memories of burning orchards and whispered prayers in languages that predated Latin. But these weren't dreams of the future or visions of hell. They were memories of the past, memories he had chosen to forget, memories of every time he had been in this place before. He woke several times to the sound of movement below. Footsteps, he thought, but when he listened carefully, the rhythm was wrong. Too many steps, or steps falling in places where no one could be walking. The footsteps had a familiar cadence, like his own gait, but multiplied, as if many versions of himself were walking through the church at once. Around 3 a.m, he woke to absolute silence. Even the wind had stopped. The temperature had dropped so severely that his breath formed clouds, even under his heavy blankets. He reached for the small flashlight beside his bed and made his way downstairs to check on Father Vasilei, though he knew what he would find. The old priest's body sat upright in his chair, sitting exactly as he had been when Crane left him hours earlier. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. Vasilei looked peaceful, almost relieved, his blind eyes finally closed. But carved into the wooden floor beneath the chair, as if burned by acid, was a single word: remember. But this time Crane did remember, standing in the flickering candlelight, looking down at Vasilei's body. The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam. He remembered finding this same body in this same position in 1987, 1995, 2003, 2011, and 2019. He remembered digging the same grave in the frozen cemetery behind the church. He remembered the same confusion, the same growing horror, the same terrible realization. And he remembered what came next. The next morning brought no dawn, just a gradual lightening of the perpetual grey sky. Crane spent an hour trying to find someone to help him with Vasilei's body, but he knew it was pointless. The villagers had all fled or hidden, or simply chosen not to exist until this cycle was complete. Finally, he wrapped the old priest in a blanket and carried him to the church's small cemetery, where he dug a grave in the frozen ground with his bare hands. But this time, as he worked, he noticed something new. The cemetery was too full. Too many graves for a village this small. Too many headstones for a community with so few families. And when he looked at the dates on the older stones, he saw a pattern. Clusters of deaths every 8 years, always in December, always including a young girl, around 14 years old. And scattered throughout the cemetery, newer graves with no headstones, just small wooden crosses bearing the same initials over and over again. Dominic Vasilei, the same priest dying and being buried every 8 years, only to return when the cycle began again. As he worked, he became aware of being watched, but this time he didn't look up immediately. This time he remembered what he would see, faces in windows throughout the village, pale, drawn faces that were the same faces he had seen before, in the same windows, in the same positions. They weren't pretending not to know him anymore. They were watching him with the patient attention of an audience watching a familiar play. When he finally looked up, he saw them clearly. The woman who had crossed herself backwards wasn't a local villager. She was Sister Margaret from the monastery where his brother had died, aged to perfection but unmistakably the same person. The old man loading firewood was Father Eduardo from his seminary, wearing mountain clothing but still recognizable after all these years. They were all there, everyone who had ever been important in his life, everyone who had shaped his faith, everyone he had ever failed or saved or lost. They had been waiting for him, playing their roles in this elaborate theatrical production designed to bring him back to this place, to this truth, to this moment of terrible clarity. After the burial, Crane made his way to the edge of the village where the Vess House stood like a monument to despair. But now he saw it clearly for what it was. Not a family home, but a stage set. A carefully constructed piece of scenery designed to house the next act of his recurring nightmare. The house was larger than it should have been, older than it could have been, filled with furniture and photographs and personal belongings that told the story of a family that had never existed. The basement entrance was sealed with heavy chains, melted wax that had hardened into grotesque shapes, and coils of twine that reeked of oil and ash, all props in an elaborate illusion, designed to make him feel like he was investigating something new. Gregor Voress answered the door before Crane could knock, but this time Crane saw through the disguise. The man was enormous, broad-shouldered, and thick-armed, but his face was wrong, too symmetrical, too perfect, like a sculpture rather than a human being. His eyes held the hollow look of someone who existed only when being observed. "You're the priest," Gregor said, not a question but a statement of fact, delivered in a voice that had no accent, no regional flavour, no personal history behind it. "You've come for the girl. You always come for the girl." This time Crane didn't pretend not to understand. "How many times have we done this?" "Does it matter?" Gregor asked, his perfect face showing no emotion. "The number only makes it worse. The first time, you thought you were saving her. The 10th time, you thought you were going insane. The 20th time, you started to understand what you really are. This time, you might actually learn something new." As Gregor led him around to the side of the house, he spoke in a way that suggested he had given this speech many times before. "The girl downstairs isn't my daughter. She isn't anyone's daughter. She's a reflection, a mirror, a way for you to see yourself clearly. Every time you look at her, you're looking at the part of yourself that you've been running from for 32 years. The chains came free with a sound like breaking bones, but Crane noticed that they weren't actually locked. They never had been. The elaborate seals and protective symbols were just decorations, theatrical props to make him feel like he was breaking into something forbidden rather than walking into something that had been prepared specifically for him. She hasn't spoken normally since her mother died, Gregor continued as they descended the narrow wooden stairs. But his words felt scripted, rehearsed. But then, she never had a mother. She never had a normal to return to. She exists only during these moments, only when you're here to witness her. The rest of the time, she's just potential, just possibility, waiting for you to return and give her purpose. The basement was exactly as Crane remembered it, exactly as it had been every time before. The air was thick and humid despite the mountain cold outside. His recording equipment, safely stored in his satchel, began to emit a low humming sound, just below the range of human hearing. But now he understood that the humming wasn't coming from his equipment. It was coming from him, from some part of himself that resonated with this place, this moment, this truth. At the bottom of the stairs was a single room, with stone walls that wept condensation despite the cold. The ceiling was low, supported by wooden beams that had warped and twisted over time into shapes that suggested meaning without quite achieving it. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting harsh shadows that moved independently of their light source. But the room was larger than it had been before. Not physically larger, but somehow more spacious, as if it existed in more dimensions than the 3 he was accustomed to, and filled with more objects, recording equipment from previous visits, notebooks filled with his own handwriting, photographs and sketches, and desperate attempts to document something that defied documentation. In the center of the room, on a simple iron cot, lay Alina Voress. But for the first time, Crane saw her clearly. She was 14 years old, but looked younger, her growth stunted by something that had nothing to do with malnutrition or disease. Her skin was unnaturally pale, not with illness, but with a kind of translucent quality that suggested she was more idea than flesh. Her hair was dark and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a halo of absolute blackness around her head. But it was her eyes that told the truth. They were his eyes. Not similar to his, not reminiscent of his, but literally his eyes, transplanted into her face with surgical precision. When she looked at him, he was looking at himself, seeing his own soul reflected back with perfect clarity. Her mouth had been sewn shut with what looked like dried sinew, but the stitches were neat, careful, almost decorative. They formed patterns that resembled letters, words, sentences in a language he was beginning to understand. And when she spoke, her voice came from everywhere at once, not just the walls and floor and air, but from inside his own head, from his own memories, from his own mouth. "Hello, Matthias," she said without moving her lips, without shifting her gaze from whatever invisible thing held her attention. "Welcome back. Are you ready to remember who you really are?" Gregor stepped back toward the stairs, his purpose fulfilled. "I'll leave you two alone," he said, but his voice was already fading, becoming less solid, as if he was dissolving back into the idea from which he had been temporarily constructed. "You know how this works. You know what comes next." Alone with Alina, Crane began to set up his recording equipment, though he knew it was pointless. He had recorded this conversation dozens of times, documented every word, catalogued every revelation. But the recording would disappear or be destroyed, or somehow become incomprehensible, because the truth he was about to rediscover was not meant to be preserved. It was meant to be experienced fresh, with all the horror and disbelief intact. The room shifted subtly around Alina's presence, but now Crane understood that the shifting was not some supernatural phenomenon. It was his own perception changing, his own memory adjusting, his own understanding of reality being recalibrated. The walls appeared damp when he first entered because that's how he expected a basement to feel. They became dry when he turned away because that's how his mind chose to process the impossibility of what he was experiencing. Dead insects littered the floor in perfect circles around Alina's cot, but they weren't killed by any demonic influence. They were drawn to something they recognized, something familiar, something that called to them from across species boundaries. They died willingly, grateful to finally encounter something that understood their true nature. Alina's shadow fell in multiple directions because she cast multiple shadows, existed in multiple states, was simultaneously the girl on the cot and the priest conducting the interview and the entity that connected them both. Her shadow was his shadow, seen from angles that normal geometry couldn't accommodate. "You want to know what I am?" Alina said, her sewn mouth never moving, her eyes never shifting from their fixed point on the far wall. "Everyone who comes here wants to know what I am. But you keep asking the wrong question, Matthias. You keep asking what when you should be asking who." Crane activated his recording equipment and settled into the wooden chair that he had placed in this exact position 5 times before. "Who are you?" "I'm you," she said simply. "I'm the part of you that you've been trying to cast out for 32 years. I'm every doubt you've suppressed, every question you've refused to ask, every moment of uncertainty you've transformed into faith through sheer force of will. I'm what happens when you try to cut away parts of your soul and pretend they never existed." Over the next 3 days, though time had no real meaning in this place, this moment stretched across decades, Crane conducted the most honest interviews of his career. Alina spoke with his voice, his knowledge, his memories, but also with wisdom and perspective that he had never possessed. She knew things that no 14-year-old girl could know, because she wasn't a 14-year-old girl. She was the accumulation of every suppressed truth he had ever encountered. She described not just his childhood home, but the thoughts he had thought in each room, the prayers he had whispered, the doubts he had buried. She knew about the fire in the monastery, because she was the doubt that had made his hand shake when he reached for the forbidden books. She was the uncertainty that had made him careless with the candle, the guilt that had transformed an accident into the foundation of his faith. "You didn't kill Francis by accident," she said during their second session, her voice coming from inside his chest now, from his own lungs and throat. "You killed him because you needed to, because you needed something terrible enough to dedicate your life to atoning for, because you needed a reason to believe in God that was stronger than your natural inclination to doubt. That's not true, isn't it? Think carefully, Matthias, not about what you remember, but about what you felt. That moment when you saw the fire spreading, when you could have shouted for help, when you could have run to get water. You hesitated. For just a moment, you stood there and thought about what would happen if Francis died. You thought about how it would change you, how it would give your life meaning, how it would transform you from a doubting child into a faithful servant of God. I was 12 years old. You were old enough to understand sacrifice, old enough to recognize opportunity, old enough to choose faith over doubt, even if the price was your brother's life. Each night, Crane's dreams became more vivid and more honest. He found himself standing in a burning orchard, but now he understood what the orchard represented. Each burning tree was a life he had touched, a person he had helped, a soul he had saved. And the thing rising from beneath the roots wasn't some external demon. It was himself, his true self, the part of himself that fed on other people's faith and called it holy. The fruits on the burning trees were the faces of everyone he had ever given spiritual guidance to, everyone who had trusted him, everyone who had believed his certainty was genuine. They burned because his faith had burned them, consumed their natural doubts and questions, and left them with nothing but ash. He began to wake with the taste of smoke and the sound of his own voice praying in languages he didn't recognize, but now he understood that these weren't alien tongues. They were the languages of pure certainty, of absolute faith, of belief so complete that it required no translation because it brooked no argument. The deaths in the village began on Thursday. but this time Crane watched them happen with full understanding. He stood at his window as Mikhail the shepherd walked into the village square in the pre-dawn darkness. The man moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of a marionette, pulled by strings that only Crane could see, strings that connected to his own hands, his own will, his own need for dramatic confirmation of supernatural forces. Mikhail twisted his own neck with methodical precision, rotating his head until it faced backward while his body remained forward. Then he removed his own eyes with his fingers, digging into the sockets with the patient determination of someone following detailed instructions. His sheep followed his lead, arranged themselves in a perfect circle, and died in unison at a signal that came from Crane's own subconscious mind. Young Pavel Ionescu walked into the forest because Crane needed him to disappear, needed a child-sized mystery to add weight to his investigation. The boy folded his clothes with care and then simply stepped out of existence, not because some supernatural force took him, but because he had never really existed in the first place. None of them had. They were all projections, all manifestations of Crane's need for a story worth documenting. Elena Popescu hanged herself with her rosary beads in a configuration that defied physics because physics was negotiable in a place that existed primarily in Crane's mind. Her death was beautiful, meaningful, poetic. Exactly the kind of supernatural puzzle that would convince a listener priest that he was dealing with genuine supernatural forces rather than his own fractured psyche. With each death, the village grew quieter, but not because people were fleeing. It grew quieter because Crane was withdrawing his attention from the peripheral characters in his personal drama, focusing more and more intensely on the central mystery that he was both investigating and creating. By Friday, he understood that the village itself was shrinking, contracting, becoming more concentrated as his attention narrowed. Buildings that had seemed solid and permanent in the distance revealed themselves to be painted facades when he approached them. People who had appeared substantial from across the square dissolved into suggestion and shadow when he tried to speak with them directly. He was editing reality in real time, creating only what he needed for his story, discarding everything else as unnecessary detail. The village wasn't dying, it was being pared down to its essential elements, refined into the perfect setting for his recurring revelation. On Saturday morning, Crane found himself drawn back to Alina's basement for the final time, but now he walked the route with full knowledge of what he would find. Every step was familiar. Every floorboard creaked exactly as he remembered it, because he had programmed this sequence into his own memory 32 years ago, and had been repeating it ever since. The basement had changed again, not physically but conceptually. The stone walls now stretched upward beyond the reach of the electric light, disappearing into darkness that suggested infinite space. The ceiling was gone entirely, replaced by a sky full of stars that moved in patterns that hurt to watch but somehow made perfect sense. Alina lay on her cot, but she was no longer alone. Surrounding her were dozens of other figures, girls from every iteration of this story, priests from every attempt to solve it, villagers from every version of Targlin Vale that Crane had constructed over the decades. They all watched him with eyes that were his own eyes, spoke with voices that were variations of his own voice, existed because he needed an audience for his personal apocalypse. "Are you ready to see?" Alina asked, and for the first time her voice came from her own mouth. The sewn threads began to snap, one by one, with soft popping sounds like breaking guitar strings. "Are you ready to stop pretending that you don't know what you are?" Crane began the ritual of witness for the final time, but now he spoke the words with full understanding of their purpose. He was not compelling a demon to reveal itself. He was compelling himself to stop hiding. The Latin phrases were not ancient formulas for supernatural investigation. They were psychological triggers he had programmed into his own mind to force himself to confront the truth he desperately wanted to avoid. "I call upon you to show yourself," he said, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was asking for. "I call upon you to reveal your nature. I call upon you to speak truth in this place." Alina's mouth opened fully as the last thread snapped away. When she spoke, it was in his own voice, not older or wearier, but exactly as he sounded at this moment, speaking in perfect synchronization with his own thoughts. "I am Father Matthias Crane, and I have been lying to myself for 32 years. I am not a servant of God. I am not a listener priest. I am not a witness to supernatural evil. I am a man who created an elaborate fantasy to avoid confronting the truth about what I am." The words came from both their mouths now, spoken in unison, a confession that he made to himself through the intermediary of his own projected guilt. "I killed my brother Francis when I was 12 years old. Not accidentally, but deliberately. I knocked over the candle because I wanted him gone. Because I needed him gone. Because I needed a tragedy large enough to transform me into someone worth believing in. I have built my entire life on that calculated murder, and I have convinced myself that it was God's will." The basement around them began to shift and change, but Crane understood now that it wasn't changing. He was finally seeing it clearly. The stone walls were not stone at all, but books. Thousands upon thousands of books stretching upward into infinity, each one containing a different version of this story, a different iteration of his attempt to solve the mystery of his own nature. Every village I have visited, every possession I have witnessed, every demon I have documented, all of it has been this same story, told over and over again with minor variations. I create the supernatural events I investigate because I need to believe in something larger than my own capacity for evil. I need to believe that there are forces in the universe more terrible than a 12-year-old boy who murders his brother for attention. The air in the impossible space began to thicken and swirl, forming shapes that resolved into a figure that Crane had been dreading to see clearly for 3 decades. But this time he forced himself to look, to really look, to see Zuliel not as an external entity, but as the reflection of his own hidden nature. Zuliel stood before him in all its terrible glory, but now Crane could see the truth behind its monstrous form. Its head was not a mask carved from ancient wood. It was his own face, aged and corrupted by years of deliberate self-deception. The bark that peeled away revealed not other faces beneath, but layers of lies, each one more elaborate than the last. Its torso did not split to reveal a library of stolen memories. It opened to show the cavity where his heart should have been, empty except for the carefully preserved image of his brother burning in the monastery fire. The flames never died in that hollow space, never consumed the memory completely because he needed it fresh and painful to fuel his manufactured guilt. Its arms were not impossibly long appendages ending in mouths. They were his own arms, extended across decades and continents, reaching into the lives of every person who had ever sought his spiritual guidance. The mouths at the end spoke not in the voices of the damned, but in the voices of everyone who had trusted him, everyone who had believed in his false certainty, everyone whose faith he had consumed to feed his own desperate need to feel righteous. The antlers rising from its back were not made of crystallized time. They were made of crystallized moments of choice. Every instant, when he could have told the truth, could have admitted his doubt, could have confessed his crime, each point held a frozen moment of decision, and in every one he had chosen deception over honesty, performance over authenticity, the comfortable lie over the unbearable truth. "I am not a demon," Zuliel said, speaking with Crane's own voice, his own words, his own terrible understanding. "I am not a supernatural entity. I am a human being who discovered that faith is the most addictive drug ever created, and I have spent 32 years manufacturing it in increasingly elaborate ways." The entity himself moved closer and Crane could see now that its monstrous appearance was just another layer of self-deception. Underneath the grotesque exterior was just a middle-aged priest, unremarkable and ordinary, distinguished only by his willingness to lie to himself on a scale that required supernatural explanation. "I create possessions because I need to feel necessary," Zuliel continued, its voice now coming from inside Crane's own chest, from his own lungs and vocal cords. "I invent demons because I need something to cast out. I construct elaborate supernatural mysteries because solving them makes me feel like I'm serving a purpose larger than my own narcissism." The truth hit Crane like a physical blow, knocking him to his knees in the impossible basement that existed only in his own fractured mind. The other priests, the other listener priests, they don't exist, do they? "There is no order of listener priests," Zuliel confirmed with infinite sadness. "There are no supernatural investigators working for the Vatican. There are no secret archives full of documented horrors. There is only you, Matthias, creating elaborate fantasies to justify your existence, to make yourself feel special, to avoid confronting the fact that you are nothing more than a murderer who has wrapped himself in the flag of religious service." The realization was so overwhelming that Crane felt his sanity slipping, but Zuliel himself caught him before he could fall completely into madness. "But that's not the worst part," the entity whispered, its voice now gentle, almost loving. "The worst part is that you're good at it. You're so good at creating these stories, these characters, these supernatural events, that you've actually helped people. The villagers in your imaginary communities, the families with supposedly possessed children, the priests who think they're working alongside you, they all feel better after you visit. They feel like their problems have been witnessed, documented, given meaning." Crane looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Are you saying that none of it was real?" "I'm saying that reality is more complicated than real or unreal," Zuliel replied, its monstrous features softening into something almost human. "Your brother Francis really died in that fire. You really were responsible. Your guilt is real, your search for redemption is real, your desire to serve something greater than yourself is real. The method you've chosen, creating elaborate supernatural dramas to solve, is unusual, but the need behind it is completely human." The basement around them began to shift again, but this time it wasn't becoming more monstrous or more impossible. It was becoming simpler, more honest. The stone walls revealed themselves to be the walls of his own apartment in Rome, the apartment where he lived between investigations, where he planned his next fictional mystery, where he wrote his reports for Vatican officials who existed only in his own imagination. "The question now," Zuliel said, its form becoming less and less distinct as Crane's need for it diminished, "is what you're going to do with this knowledge. You could continue the cycle, forget this revelation, invent a new mystery, create a new village full of people who need your help. Or you could try something different." "What would be different?" "You could help people without lying to them. You could serve God without pretending to have supernatural authority. You could find redemption through honest work instead of elaborate fantasy." Crane looked around his apartment. Not a church attic, not a basement in Targlin Vale, but his own small living space filled with years of accumulated research into supernatural phenomena. Books on demonology that he had annotated with fictional observations. Photographs of possessed individuals who were actually just people he had met in the course of ordinary life. Recording equipment that had captured thousands of hours of his own voice, speaking in different accents and personas, creating the illusion of supernatural encounters. "Targlin Vale doesn't exist," he said, not a question but a statement of fact that he was finally ready to accept. "Not as a physical place," Zuliel agreed, its voice now barely distinguishable from his own thoughts. "But it exists as a metaphor, as a symbol, as a recurring dream that forces you to confront the truth about yourself. Every few years, when the guilt becomes unbearable, when the lies pile up too high, you create a new version of this story to shock yourself back into awareness. Crane picked up one of his recording devices and looked at it with new understanding. And the recordings? They're real. Every word you've spoken, every observation you've made, every moment of genuine insight you've had while investigating these fictional mysteries, all of it is documented. The supernatural framework is imaginary, but the psychological truth underneath it is absolutely authentic. Standing up slowly, Crane walked to his window and looked out at the real world. Not the fictional village of Targlin Vale, but the streets of Rome, filled with real people dealing with real problems that didn't require supernatural explanation. What happens to Father Vasilei? To the girl? To all the people I've created over the years? They return to what they were before you needed them, Zuliel said, its voice now coming from his own reflection in the window glass. They become potential again, waiting for the next story, the next crisis, the next time you need to learn this lesson, because you will forget again, Matthias. Not completely, not immediately, but gradually. The human mind is very good at protecting itself from unbearable truths. How many times have I done this? This is the 6th iteration. The first time, in 1987, you were completely convinced that everything was real. By the 3rd time, in 2003, you started to suspect. This time, you've actually seen through to the core truth. Progress of a sort. Crane sat down at his desk, which was covered with notes and sketches and fragments of a dozen different supernatural investigations. All of it was his own handwriting, his own artistic style, his own elaborate attempt to convince himself that he was part of something larger and more meaningful than one man's guilt over a childhood crime. The letter from Father Vasilei, he said, picking up the wax-sealed envelope that had started this latest journey. I wrote it myself, didn't I? With your non-dominant hand, in deliberately shaky script, using Latin phrases that you learned specifically for this purpose. You even aged the paper with tea and exposed it to heat to make it look old. The attention to detail is really quite impressive. Crane opened the letter and read it again, recognizing now his own elaborate attempt to create mystery and urgency around a situation that existed only in his imagination. And the photographs, taken with a timer using makeup and costumes you've accumulated over the years. The girl in the pictures is you, Matthias, dressed in a wig and altered with careful lighting. The backgrounds are composite images created from pictures of various European villages. The recognition was both devastating and oddly liberating. For 32 years, he'd been living in an elaborate fantasy, but it was a fantasy of his own creation, which meant it was also under his own control. Can I stop? You can try, Zuliel said, its reflection in the window becoming more and more transparent. But stopping means accepting that you are not special, not chosen, not blessed with supernatural authority. It means accepting that you are just a man who made a terrible mistake as a child and has spent his adult life trying to atone for it in increasingly elaborate ways. Crane picked up his pen and began to write. Not a report on supernatural phenomena, but a simple, honest account of what he had realized. My name is Father Matthias Crane. I'm 44 years old. When I was 12, I deliberately killed my brother Francis by setting fire to the monastery where we lived. I have spent the last 32 years creating elaborate supernatural mysteries to investigate, because solving fictional problems makes me feel like I'm serving God rather than serving my own need to feel important. The words felt strange on the page, naked and vulnerable, after decades of ornate supernatural speculation, but they also felt clean, honest, real, in a way that his fictional investigations never had. The village of Targlin Vale exists only in my imagination, he continued writing. The possessed girl named Alina Voress is a creation of my own guilt and self-hatred. The entity I call Zuliel is my own capacity for self-deception, given form and voice so that I can have conversations with parts of myself that I'm normally unable to access. As he wrote, the apartment around him seemed to become more solid, more real, more present. The fictional elements of his life, the supernatural artifacts, the mysterious documents, the evidence of otherworldly encounters, faded into what they had always been, props in an elaborate performance for an audience of one. But I want to try something different now, he wrote, his hand steady for the first time in years. I want to see if it's possible to serve God and serve other people without lying to them or to myself. I want to see if redemption is possible through honest work, rather than fictional heroics. He paused, considering his next words carefully. I don't know if I can maintain this clarity. Previous attempts to break the cycle have failed, and I may forget this revelation just as I've forgotten the others. But I'm going to try to leave myself better clues this time. I'm going to try to make it harder to slip back into the comfortable lies. Standing up, Crane walked through his apartment with new eyes, seeing it clearly for the first time in decades. The religious artifacts on his walls were not mystical objects charged with supernatural power. They were ordinary items that he had imbued with fictional significance. The books on his shelves were not research texts on authentic phenomena. They were fantasy novels and folklore collections that he had annotated to create the illusion of scholarly investigation. But scattered among the fictional elements were real things. Letters from actual people who had sought his spiritual guidance, photographs of genuine friends and colleagues, evidence of a life that existed outside his elaborate fantasy. Not a dramatic life, not a supernatural life, but a real life with real relationships and real responsibilities. The tragedy, he said aloud, speaking to Zuliel, though the entity was no longer visible, is that I probably could have helped just as many people by being honest about my limitations. People don't need their priest to have supernatural authority. They just need someone who will listen to them with compassion and help them find meaning in their struggles. In the silence that followed, Crane heard something he hadn't heard in years. The sound of traffic outside his window, the voices of children playing in the street, the ordinary noise of a real world populated by real people dealing with real problems. It was less dramatic than the supernatural mysteries he had been investigating, but it was also infinitely more important. He walked to his window and opened it, letting in the sound and smell and feel of authentic life. Below he could see people going about their daily business, not actors in his personal drama, not projections of his subconscious mind, but independent beings with their own stories, their own struggles, their own need for connection and meaning. Tomorrow, he said, still speaking to the empty air where Zuliel had been, I'm going to try something radical. I'm going to walk outside this apartment and offer to help someone with a genuine problem. Not a supernatural problem, not a mysterious problem, just an ordinary human problem that I might actually be qualified to address. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. After decades of solving fictional mysteries with guaranteed dramatic resolutions, the prospect of dealing with real problems that might not have clear solutions felt like stepping off a cliff. But it also felt like the first honest thing he had contemplated doing since he was 12 years old. He returned to his desk and added a final paragraph to his written confession. If anyone ever reads this, if I disappear again into one of my fictional investigations, please know that this moment of clarity was real. The priest who created supernatural mysteries to solve was elaborate fiction, but the priest who wants to serve others honestly is the truest thing about me. Help me remember who I really am, not who I've been pretending to be. Crane sealed the confession in an envelope and wrote on the outside, to be opened if Father Matthias Crane claims to be investigating supernatural phenomena. Then He placed it in the center of his desk, where he would be sure to see it if he tried to plan another fictional mystery. As night fell over Rome, Crane did something he hadn't done in 32 years. He prayed honestly. Not the elaborate, dramatic prayers of a man convinced of his own supernatural authority, but the simple, desperate prayer of someone who had finally run out of lies to tell himself. "God," he said, kneeling beside his bed like the child he had been before everything went wrong. "I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if you've ever been listening, but I'm tired of pretending to know your will. Tired of speaking for you. Tired of using your name to justify my own need to feel special. If you're there, help me learn how to serve you honestly. If you're not there, help me learn how to serve others anyway." He slept that night without dreams, without visions, without supernatural visitations, just ordinary sleep, the kind that comes to people who have finally stopped running from themselves. When he woke the next morning, Crane found his confession exactly where he had left it, but beside it was a simple note in his own handwriting. "Today, try helping one real person with one real problem. See what happens." He dressed in ordinary clothes, not his formal clerical attire, but the kind of clothing worn by someone who existed in the real world, rather than in supernatural fiction. Then he walked outside, into the streets of Rome, not to investigate mysterious phenomena, but to see if there was someone who might benefit from the honest attention of a deeply flawed, but genuinely repentant human being. The story of Father Matthias Crane's supernatural investigations ended that morning. But the story of Matthias Crane the person, a story with no guaranteed dramatic resolutions, no supernatural validation, no elaborate justifications for his continued existence, that story was just beginning. And for the first time in 32 years, he was genuinely curious to see how it would end. In a small apartment in Rome, filed between books on fictional demonology and manufactured mystery, a sealed confession sits waiting. It contains 47 minutes of the most honest testimony ever recorded by a man who spent 3 decades lying to himself about the nature of truth. The confession ends with these words: "The most dangerous prayer is the one that gets answered exactly as you hoped it would." Because if you're absolutely certain God is speaking to you, you should probably ask yourself, what if it's not God at all? What if it's just you, talking to yourself, creating the drama you need to feel important? But below that, in different ink, added sometime later, are these words: "The most healing prayer is the one that admits you don't know what you're asking for. The prayer that says, help me serve something larger than myself, even if I never understand what that something is, even if I never get to feel special for serving it." The recording continues even now, somewhere in the space between faith and doubt, between memory and truth, between the God we hope exists and the very human need to feel chosen by that God. But now it's an honest recording, made by someone willing to admit his limitations, his failures, his desperate need for redemption that doesn't require supernatural validation. Listen carefully, question everything, especially your own certainty. And remember, the most perfect faith is the one that's willing to serve without knowing if it's serving anything at all. The testimony ends here, but the real story, the story of what happens when someone stops creating fictional problems to solve and starts addressing real ones, that story is still being written. In Rome, in a small apartment, by a man who finally learned the difference between serving God and serving his own need to feel godlike. And that difference, it turns out, makes all the difference in the world.